My name is Sandra Reeves. I'm 38 years old, and I want to tell you about a photograph on my mother's refrigerator. She has never mentioned putting it there. I have never mentioned noticing it. It has been there for 7 years. It is a photograph of me in my army dress uniform taken at my promotion ceremony when I was made captain. I am standing at attention in the specific pose of military formal photography, straight, composed in the uniform that carries on its surface the record of what I have done and where I have been. The photograph was taken by a unit photographer. My mother was not at the ceremony. She put it on the refrigerator 2 months after the ceremony. I noticed it the first time I visited her after that. I did not say anything. She has never said anything. It is still there. This is the whole center of this story, the thing that cannot be said directly, held between two people who love each other and cannot find the language, expressed instead in a photograph that went up without acknowledgement and has stayed without explanation for 7 years. I need to start where this story actually begins. My mother, Catherine Reeves, grew up in rural Georgia in the 1960s. She is not a woman without complexity or intelligence. She raised 3 children largely alone after my father left when I was 9. She built a career in hospital administration from an entry-level position. She is sharp and observant and has opinions about everything. She is also a woman formed by a specific time and place that encoded specific beliefs about what women were and what women were not, and those beliefs have not revised themselves fully or easily. Women don't belong in combat, she said it the first time when I was 23 and told her I was enlisting. Not joining an office, enlisting in the infantry. She said, the infantry. I said, yes. She said, Sandra, women don't belong in combat. I said, women have been in combat. We've been in every war this country has fought. She said, not officially. I said, the distinction between official and actual has always been smaller than people admit. She said, that's not the point. The point is that you're putting yourself in danger that you don't need to be in. I said, people put themselves in that danger because it's necessary, because someone has to. She said, someone, not you. I said, why not me? She did not have an answer to that question that she was satisfied with. I could see it, the specific quality of someone searching for an answer that their framework should contain, but that isn't presenting itself in the form required. She said, because you're my daughter. I said, yes, I am, and I'm enlisting. I enlisted. I want to walk through the following 15 years carefully because the details matter to the photograph on the refrigerator. I went into the infantry at 23. In 2010, women were officially barred from infantry and special operations units. But the operational reality of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan had produced something that the official policy had not accounted for: the female engagement teams and cultural support teams that attach women to infantry and special operations units for specific missions, and the combat situations that arise when you are operating in a war zone, regardless of your official. I was not in a female engagement team. I was in a military police unit that operated in support of infantry operations in Afghanistan. The distinction between being officially in a combat role and operationally in situations involving direct threat was, in my experience, as thin as the official policymakers had hoped, and as people who had been paying attention to reality had understood. I was in Afghanistan for 9 months. I am not going to describe what those 9 months contained in detail, partly because some of it is not mine to describe. It belongs to the people who were there with me, and partly because the specific content of those months is not the point of this story. The point is what my mother did and did not know about it, and what she has and has not said about it since. She knew I was deployed. I wrote to her actual letters, because email and forward operating bases was unreliable, and because I had been raised by a woman who wrote letters and understood their weight. She wrote back. The letters were careful on both sides. I did not describe the details of what I was doing. She did not ask. We discussed my health and my comfort and the book she was reading and what was happening with my brother and sister. We discussed everything except the thing that was actually happening. I came home. My mother drove 4 hours to see me at Fort Campbell when I returned. She stood at the base of the ramp where the aircraft deplaned, and she hugged me in the fierce, particular way of someone who has been afraid for 9 months and is now releasing the fear into the physical reality of their child being present and whole. She did not say she had been afraid. She said, you look thin. I said, I've been in Afghanistan, Mom. She said, I know, come home and I'll feed. We did not talk about Afghanistan, not really. I offered some things: the landscape, the food, the people I had served with. She listened and asked questions that kept to the surface, and I understood, without either of us saying so, that there were things she didn't want to know specifically and that I was not going to force on her. The photograph went on the refrigerator 2 months after I made captain. I was 31 when I made captain. I had by then served 8 years, done 2 deployments, Afghanistan and then a second tour shorter in Kuwait, and built a record that had earned promotions and commendations and the specific professional standing that comes from doing difficult work well over a sustained period. My mother was not at the ceremony. She has not attended any of my military ceremonies. Not from hostility. She has attended things that were important to me in other domains of my life without. But the military ceremonies have always required her to be in a space that is defined by the thing she has spent 15 years having ambivalence about, and the ambivalence has consistently won out over the attendance. I understand this. I do not think she is wrong to have the ambivalence. The things she worried about when I was 23 were real things. The danger was real, the risk was real, the possibility that her daughter would not come home was a possibility she lived with for 9 months while I was in Afghanistan and while she wrote me careful letters about books and family. What I have struggled with, in the particular quiet way that you struggle with things that have no clean resolution, is the gap between what she has said and what she has done. She has said, women don't belong in combat. She has put my photograph in my dress uniform on her refrigerator. She has never acknowledged either the statement or the photograph in relation to each other. And I have never pushed. I want to explain why I have never pushed, because the not pushing is the most deliberate part of my behavior in this story and the part that has required the most consideration. I have not pushed because the photograph tells me something that confrontation would require my mother to choose, to defend the original statement or to retract it, to explain the photograph or to take it down, to resolve the contradiction in one direction or the other. And the resolution in either direction would be less true than the contradiction itself. The contradiction is her actual position. She believes women don't belong in combat. She also has my photograph on her refrigerator. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and the simultaneous truth of them is more accurate than any resolved version would be. If she retracted the statement, she would be performing a reconsideration she may not have fully made. If she took down the photograph, she would be losing something she clearly wants. The contradiction is where she actually is, and I have decided after 15 years of consideration that the contradiction is enough for me to work with. She has not said so, not directly, not in the specific words that the phrase "I am proud of you" would require. But the photograph is on the refrigerator. My sister told me once that my mother has the photograph as her phone wallpaper too. I did not know this. My sister said she has 2 photos on her phone wallpaper. One is her grandchildren, one is you in your dress uniform. I said she's never mentioned that. My sister said of course she hasn't, It's not, my sister said, she tells people about you, Sandra, not when you're around, when you're not around. She tells people what you've done and where you've been. She doesn't use the word proud, but she describes your career in the specific detail of someone who has been paying very close attention. I said she's never told me that. My sister said no, but she tells everyone else. I sat with that for a long time after the conversation with my sister. She tells everyone else. She tells people what I have done and where I have been. She describes my career in specific detail. She has my photograph on her phone and on her refrigerator. She wrote me careful letters for 9 months while I was in Afghanistan and drove 4 hours to meet me when I came home. She has not said, I was wrong about women in combat. She has not said, I am proud of you. She has not said anything that directly revises the statement she made when I was 23. That is the full picture. The statement was made once 15 years ago and has not been made again. The photograph went up 7 years ago and has not come down. I have been thinking about this combination, the statement that was not repeated and the photograph that was not explained, for 7 years, and I have arrived at a conclusion that I want to share because I think it is the truest thing I can say about it. She revised. Not completely, not in the explicit accountable way of someone who says I was wrong and this is what I understand now, but internally in the specific way that people revise things that are connected to fear, gradually, imperfectly, without announcement, in the privacy of their own understanding. She revised. The revision did not produce a conversation. It produced a photograph on a refrigerator. I think about my grandfather sometimes, my mother's father, a man I did not know well because he died when I was 11. He was from the same rural Georgia that formed my mother. He had the same specific set of beliefs about what women were and were not. He would not have understood my career any more easily than my mother did, and probably less easily, because the distance between his formation and my profession was larger. But my mother told me once when I was a teenager and asking about him that he had kept a scrapbook. A physical scrapbook, the kind that people maintained in earlier decades when the digital archiving of information did not exist. He kept clippings and photographs and notes about things that mattered to him. My mother was in the scrapbook. Every significant thing she had done was in the scrapbook. He never told her. She found the scrapbook after he died. She told me this when I was 15, and it had the specific quality of a story that still mattered to her 20 years after the fact, the story of finding documentation of love that had never been directly expressed. I thought about that story the first time I saw my photograph on her refrigerator. I think about it still. The scrapbook is how he loved her. The refrigerator is how she loves me. Neither of them found words for it. Neither of them needed to. I want to tell you about the most recent visit to my mother's house because something happened that I have been turning over since. I was home for Christmas 3 months ago. My mother's house in Georgia, the house she has lived in for 23 years, the house where I grew up, the house that smells in the specific way of place you have always known. I was in the kitchen making coffee. My mother was at the table. It was early morning before anyone else was awake. She said, "Your unit." "One you're with now," I said. "The medical logistics unit." "Yes," she said. "Are they going to deploy you again?" I said, "Possibly, there's talk, nothing confirmed." She said, "Where?" I said, "I can't say specifically, somewhere in the Middle East theater." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Do you want to go?" I said, "That's a complicated question." She said, "I know, answer it anyway." I said, "I want to do my job. If the job requires deployment, I want to deploy." She said, "That's not an answer." I said, "It's as honest as I can be." She said, "Sandra." I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you afraid?" I said, "When it comes to it, yes." Appropriately, she said, "Is that training the appropriate part?" I said, "Yes." They teach you to have the fear and work with it rather than pretending it isn't there. She said, that seems right. I said, I think so. She said, I was afraid. When you were in Afghanistan. I said, I know. She said, every day. I said, I know, Mom. She said, I wrote you letters. I said, yes. I have them. She said, you kept them. I said, everyone. She was quiet. She picked up her coffee cup and looked out the window at the Georgia morning, the specific pale light of a December day in the South, the kind of light that makes everything look quiet whether it is or not. She said, you keep the letters. I said, yes. She said, I have yours too. I said, from Afghanistan? She said, yes. I have all of them. I said, in the box. She said, how did you know about the box? I said, I saw it once when I was looking for something. I didn't look inside. She said, there's a box in my closet with your letters in it and a copy of every promotion announcement and the program from the ceremony when you got the commendation medal. She said, I couldn't come to that ceremony. I wanted to. I said, I know. She said, why didn't I come? I said, you were scared to. She said, of what? I said, of being in a room where the thing you've been ambivalent about is the main subject. She looked at me. She said, is that what I've been ambivalent? I said, I think so. Yes. She said, I said, women don't belong in combat. I said, yes, when I was 23. She said, I was wrong. She said it quietly in the way of someone who has been working up to something for a long time and has finally found the moment. She said, I was wrong about that. Not because you didn't get hurt, you didn't, you came home whole, and I am grateful for that every single day. But because the belonging was never mine to decide, it was yours, and you decided you belonged there, and 15 years of your career has shown that you were right. I said, Mom. She said, I have your photograph on my refrigerator. I said, I know. She said, I know you know. I've always known you know. I said, why did you put it up? She said, because I'm proud of you and I didn't know how to say it any other way. She said, I'm still not sure I know how to say it any other way, but I'm going to try. She said, I am proud of you, Sandra. I have been proud of you for a long time, and I was wrong about the combat. And I'm sorry it took me 15 years to say it directly. I said, you've been saying it the whole time. She said, in the wrong language. I said, your language. She said, yes, my father's language. The scrapbook language. I said, I understood it. She said, you shouldn't have had to. I said, maybe not, but I did, and it was enough. She said, was it? I said, yes, the letters from Afghanistan, the box in the closet, the photograph on the refrigerator. Yes, it was enough. She said, the photograph on the phone too. I said, my sister told me. She said, of course she did. I said, Mom. I said, I have your letters too in a box. I have every letter you wrote me in Afghanistan and everything you've sent me since. She said, you do? I said, yes, because that's how I say the things I don't know how to say directly. She looked at me. She said, we are very similar. I said, yes. She said, I wasn't going to say that. I said, I know, but it's true. She said, yes, it is. We sat in the kitchen and drank our coffee while Georgia woke up outside the window. Neither of us said anything more for a while. The letters were in boxes in our closets. The photograph was on the refrigerator. That had always been enough. Now the words were there too. That was more than enough. That was everything. I am 38 years old. I am an Army officer with 15 years of service. My mother has my photograph on her refrigerator and on her phone and a box of my letters in her closet. She said she was wrong. She said she was proud. She said it in December in a kitchen in Georgia over coffee in the pale light of a southern morning. 15 years after the first time she said women don't belong in combat. 7 years after the photograph went up without explanation. One morning in December. That is the complete shape of this story. Not a confrontation, not a ceremony, a kitchen, coffee, the pale December light. The words finally, in addition to everything else that had already been saying them. That is enough. That has always been enough. Some mothers speak in scrapbooks and refrigerator photographs and boxes of letters in closets. And some daughters learn to read that language. In some mornings in December the language becomes words too. And that is when it becomes everything. There is something I want to add, something about the week after Christmas that completes the picture in a way that the kitchen conversation alone does not. I stayed at my mother's house for 4 days over the holiday. The morning conversation in the kitchen was on the second day. The remaining 2 days were different from any I have spent there before, in the specific way that things are different after something has been said that was long waiting to be said. Not dramatically different, not the transformed relationship of a film's third act. More like a slight loosening of something that had always been present, a quality of ease in the ordinary exchanges that had previously required a certain amount of navigation. She asked about my work, not the general outline that she had always acknowledged, the specific work. The medical logistics project I was currently managing, what it involved, why it mattered, how the supply chains worked and why improving them had consequences for soldiers in the field. She asked follow-up questions that showed she had understood the first answer and was building on it. This was new, not the interest she had always been interested in the way I now understood the scrapbook language to work, but the directness, the willingness to engage with the specifics rather than the surface. On the third day she asked me to show her something. I said, what? She said, anything, something from your work that you can show me. Something that helps me understand what you actually do. I said, I have some unclassified materials on my laptop. Presentation slides from a briefing I gave last year on the logistics restructuring project. She said, show me. I showed her. She sat next to me at the kitchen table and I walked her through the slides, the problem statement, the methodology, the data, the outcomes. She asked questions throughout. Not the questions of someone performing interest, the questions of someone who is actually trying to understand. At the end she said, this is the kind of thing that saves lives. I said, if the supply chains fail, people die waiting for what they need. Yes, she said, and you've been doing this. I said this and other things for 15 years. She said 15 years of this. I said yes, she said, and I've never asked to see it. I said you never asked. She said I was afraid of what I would see. I said what were you afraid of? She said that it would be too real, that if I understood what you were actually doing I wouldn't be able to maintain the distance that let me function when you were deployed. I said the distance. She said the not knowing the specifics. It was protective. I understood that, but it was also not entirely fair to you. I said I understood it. She said that doesn't make it fair. I said no. She said what would you have wanted? I said I would have wanted you to ask. Not to know everything. There are things you wouldn't be cleared for and things I wouldn't want to burden you with, but to ask more than you did. She said I'm asking now. I said I know. She said is it too late? I said for what? She said to start asking. To understand what you do, to catch up on 15 years of not asking enough. I said no, it's not too late. She said good. She said I said then start. She said the medical logistics project. You said there were outcomes, specific outcomes. How do you measure whether it worked? And we were back in the slides an hour later than I expected to be, my mother asking questions about supply chain metrics in the specific engaged way of someone who has decided to understand something and is bringing the full force of her intelligence to it. She is not a woman without intelligence. She has managed a hospital department for 20 years. She understands complex systems. She had simply never applied that understanding to the work I was doing because the work was inside the ambivalence, and the ambivalence had kept her at a specific distance. The distance closed in a kitchen in Georgia over 2 hours of logistics briefing slides. That is, in its own way, more significant than anything else that happened in those 4 days. On the 4th day before I drove to the airport, I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the refrigerator. The photograph was there. It has always been there. It will be there, I imagine, for as long as my mother lives in this house. She came up behind me. She said, it'll stay there. I said, I know. She said, I might add to it. I said, add what? She said, whatever comes next. The next promotion, if there is one, whatever happens next in your career, I want it documented. I said the scrapbook language. She said yes, my father's language. She said but also words now, both. I said both is better. She said yes. She said Sandra. I said yes. She said I'm going to come to the next ceremony, whatever it is, wherever it is. I said Mom. She said I know I haven't. I know that's cost you something. I want to start coming. I said okay. She said I'm not promising to be comfortable. I said I'm not asking you to be comfortable. She said I'll be there. I drove to the airport. I am 38 years old. My mother has my photograph on her refrigerator and on her phone. She has a box of my letters in her closet. She has, as of December, presentation slides from a medical logistics briefing that she asked to see and spent 2 hours understanding. She said she was wrong about women in combat. She said she was proud. She said she wants to come to the next ceremony. She said both, the scrapbook link. Both is better. She is right. I am going to let her be there. I am going to let her see the next thing, whatever size room it is, whatever the occasion, whatever the uniform requires. She will be in the 2nd row or the 3rd or wherever she lands. She will be there. That is the complete story, not the photograph alone, not the words alone. Both, finally both, that is enough, that is everything. That is the whole of what the story has always been building toward, the photograph. The next ceremony, both, finally, one last thing. My sister called me the week after I got home from Christmas. She does this, calls after family gatherings to debrief, to share what she noticed, to say the things that the gathering itself didn't have room for. She said something was different this Christmas. I said yes. She said with you and Mom. I said yes. She said what happened? I said she said she was wrong about the combat. She said she was proud. We talked about my work. She asked to see my briefing slides. My sister was quiet for a moment. She said she asked to see your briefing slides. I said yes. 2 hours of logistics supply chain data. She said our mother. I said yes. She said who has never once asked to see anything related to your work. I said yes. She said Sandra. I said yes. She said do you know what she told me before Christmas when we were talking about your visit? I said what? She said she had. I said practicing what? She said how to ask you about your work. She said she had been thinking about it for months. She had been trying to figure out what questions to ask that would be real questions. That would show you she actually wanted to understand. She said she told me she had written down questions on a notepad and practiced asking them so they would sound natural. I sat with that for a long moment. My mother, who has my photograph on her refrigerator and who has a box of my letters in her closet and has never mentioned it, who has been telling people about my career for 15 years without telling me, who wrote down questions on a notepad and practiced asking them so they would sound natural. I said she practiced. My sister said for months. I said, and she said it was the scrapbook language. Her father never told her about the scrapbook. She found it after he died. My sister said she doesn't want you to find out after. My sister said she's trying to do it while there's still time. I said yes. My sister said it's very her, Sandra, the practicing, the notepad, the way she prepared for a conversation about asking you questions, the way she would prepare for a professional presentation. I said yes. I said it's very her. My sister said, are you all right? I said yes. I said she practiced. My sister said for months. I said for a conversation with her daughter. My sister said yes. I said that's love. My sister said yes, that's exactly what that is. I am 38 years old. My mother has my photograph on her refrigerator. She practiced asking me questions about my work for months before Christmas. She said she was proud. She said she was wrong. She said she wants to come to the next ceremony. She wrote down questions on a notepad. That is love in the scrapbook language. That is love in words. That is love finally in both. I am going to let it be both. I am going to let her come to the next ceremony. I am going to answer every question she practiced asking. That is everything, that is enough, that has always been enough. Some mothers speak in photographs and practiced questions and notepads. Learn to read the language. And then when the words come to, let them be enough, let them be everything.